So the title of my presentation, as you can see, Make Europe Great Again, but actually the subtitle is more important. The subtitle is How I Learned to Love Populism. You can make the argument that as a Hungarian, I either have to love populism or just exit word, but this was an intellectual process for me as well. So let's start with a little introduction. As you may know, this painting is everywhere nowadays, and it reflects and represents populism as a phenomenon. Do you happen to know the story behind this painting, why it became the symbol of populism? Have you seen this painting? You can see it in memes and everywhere. So the basic idea is that this was painted in 1930 by a guy called Grant Wood, and Grant Wood was a painter who grew up in a rural family, an agricultural family, what you may call a redneck family. But then he moved to the big cities, to New York, and he became an artist. So he also got engaged with the urban culture as well. So he had both elements in his life. And he made this painting in 1930, and actually the main important part of the painting is the building behind the people, but the two people became the most important part later, because this painting actually was highly debated in 1930. What is the reason behind this? Naturally, the painting was published presented in a museum in New York, as far as I remember, or Chicago maybe, but in a big city, that's for sure. And the urban elite thought that he was making a joke about agricultural people. So you can see the expression of their faces. They are a little bit confused. They don't have a sense of what is going on. That is how the urban elite interpreted the painting. But there were those people who came from another background, from an agricultural background, from a rural background, who thought that this picture is about celebrating this rural culture, celebrating the efforts of these people. Remember, we are talking about 1930, so celebrating the efforts of the struggle of the American agricultural population about fighting the economic crisis and the way in which that affected everyday life. Besides confusion, you will also going to see that the expression on the faces of the people are also of dignity. They don't know what is going on, but they also willing to fight it. You have the fork as a metaphor for the fight as well. So for one part of the society, for the urban part of the society, this was a matter of a joke, but for the rural community, it was a matter of dignity and pride. And this is how this dual understanding of populism and populist needs from the society is being represented on this very painting, and this is why this became a symbol of populism. Because if you talk to people who vote for populist parties, maybe they are confused, but this is not their primary experience. Their primary experience is fighting, struggling, and on the other hand, dignity and pride about their everyday culture. So this is why it is very dangerous to make joke about these populist voters. So I will address 4 questions. They will get more and more interesting each time. My first question is, how should we interpret populism? Populism was there and is there with us, not just in Europe, but in every part of the world. But naturally, in the West, we experience it, especially in the last couple of years, as we already mentioned this. Actually, when I talked to a Pakistani researcher about populism recently in Europe, he was fed up. He said that he was fed up with this Western feeling of shame and questions about populism, because he said that they are facing this problem, this phenomenon, which we call populism, for decades now. But they call this orderism. So what is populism and what went wrong with the West, we might ask. Naturally, after the Cold War, we can see that the world was a very optimistic place. We had the end of history as we know it. As you know, the start of this new world can be set by the 1990 speech of George Bush, who started to talk about a new world order which was based on sovereignty, which was based on the acceptance of international law, human development, and so on. So this was a very good idea, and actually Western liberalism and globalization was able to produce very good results in the world. You can see in this picture that poverty extreme poverty is on the decline in the last couple of decades. You can see that the people who are illiterate, the number of people who are illiterate is decreasing as well. You can see that the level of education is growing in each region of the world. And also the number of world citizens who are living under an authoritarian regime is also on the decrease. So everything went well, right? So why are voters not okay with this situation, which is on constant improvement and increasing living standards? One part of the problem is comparing absolute and relative gains in the society. It is true that in the past couple of decades, in the West and everywhere in the world, we can see absolute gains for almost each citizen because of literacy, because of growing education possibilities, and so on. But because this is happening to everyone, and it is happening more to the elite, that is why these gains are only seen in absolute terms and not relative terms. If everybody is getting better, then the individual doesn't see this as a necessary positive development, just a fact of life. He or she won't feel better about this situation necessarily, because he or she had to compare this situation to the last generation situation, and naturally an individual cannot do that. So you always compare yourself to the other parts of the society, right? And if you don't feel that you are doing better than them, or even feel that they are doing better than you, even if that means that there is only a difference in getting better, then that means that you will be unsatisfied with how things are going. If you see that others are better, then you will feel that you are not doing better, so that's a problem. On this chart, you can see the Gini ratio of each society, which measures inequalities in the states, in the different states. You can see that, for example, in the case of the United States, it's on the rise. So inequality is on the rise. This is a very clear tendency. And this is true almost for all states in Europe. Not necessarily that the inequality is rising, but it is not declining. And this is a very important problem. If you see Central European states, you can see that in many cases, the inequality is even rising in the societies. It can be true that the GDP is growing and we are getting better and better, but since the society is getting more unequal, people get offended and get problems from this society. So when it comes to Hungary, there was a very interesting survey which wanted to investigate how the regime change affected societies. What do you think? How many percentage of the Hungarian society felt that they are doing better because of the regime change? 60? 50? Actually 15% of the society. 70% said that they are relatively the same, and the lower 15% said that they don't benefit from the regime change. So this is the situation we are dealing with. And the populist parties can go for these 85% of the society, because even them, they see that there are people who are getting better, but they are on relatively the same situation. And that is a very major problem. So this is the problem. Populism is not a problem. Populism is only a reaction to that. And that's very important to bear in mind. So what is populism? How can we define populism? In the academic literature, there are three ways to capture the essence of populism. The first one is a rhetoric style. I don't think that this is a very useful definition, but many people use it. A second one concentrates on populism as a label. So you can say to your political opponent that he or she is a populist, and then you can get some votes on the basis of those who reject populism. And also, based on the literature of Kasmude, for example, we can conceptualize populism as a political ideology, a very narrow or a very thin political ideology, which can have many different forms. But there are two elements of these populist ideologies which are there in almost all cases. The first is that you have a binary worldview. So a binary worldview. So you divide the society into two groups. You have the elite and you have the society. You have the people. So there is the elite and there is the society. And the second important part is that they see these groups as homogeneous. So the elite is homogeneously bad, the society is homogeneously good. And this divide creates the tension and creates the ideology and creates the need for change, because it is the bad elite who controls the situation. And we, the good people, have to change that. That's the basic idea. If you think of it, this is not a new idea. This was there in history of humanity. And that's not necessarily a bad idea, right? We always felt this. Even since we are here and we enjoy the hospitality of our colleagues from Lisbon, we even made some jokes about banks building up in Lisbon. And about the fact that they are always getting away with everything, right? So we have this feeling that the elite is controlling things and we are excluded from these things. So when it comes to populism, I think it is important to see this as a market for populism. In the market of populism, there is a demand for populism and there is a supply for populism. It is very easy to concentrate on the supply of populism with these guys. It is very easy to concentrate on them. But they are not important to us, I think. They are useful for us, actually, because they can highlight that there is a demand for new ideas, there is a demand for populism, there is a demand for new ideologies, and we should concentrate on this part, not that part, because if we can concentrate on this part, and if we can make a supply for these demands, then these guys will lose leverage. So when is the demand for populism rising? According to literature, there are 4 phenomena which need to be present if there is a rise in the demand for populism. The first one is the feel of danger. If you feel that your lifestyle or country, your state is in danger, you will vote populist. Also an important requirement, the feeling of the lack of consequences. If you feel that political actions don't have consequences and the elite can get away with everything, you will vote populist. Third, corruption. If you feel that the society is corrupt and the elite is corrupt, then you will vote populist. And the fourth requirement is the possibility of cognitive mobilization. This sounds a little bit academic. This only means that if the means for mobilized people, for example online, is getting easier, then populism can use this idea. So if you have these 4 ideas, the feel of danger, the feel of the lack of consequences, the feel of corruption, and the possibility of cognitive mobilization, then you are good to go. You can make a good populist party. And if you see this, these are not extraordinary feelings. These feelings are there in many societies nowadays. So when it comes to populism and the populist parties, how can we interpret this? I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because then I have to talk about this for like 2 hours. But very quickly, how can we interpret nowadays European populism? First, we can see a revolt. Many interpret populism as a revolt of the voters. What does this mean? This means that mainstream parties are behaving in a bad way. They are not effective. They don't tackle the problems of the European societies. And also, or that at least this is how society feels. And also because of the great idea that every party should concentrate on the center, every party became the same, right? Everybody's shooting for the center, so everybody has the same idea. My students in the university cannot differentiate between socialist, liberal, and conservative parties. They cannot. Why? We are teaching these ideologies, but all these parties in their eyes are behaving in the same way. There is no major difference. And this creates a feeling of the lack of choices, basically. The second is the revolt of the working class. You know this narrative regarding the so-called betrayal of the left-wing parties of the working class in the last 20 years or so. There is this idea in the left that you should support all disenfranchised people of the society, but spoiler alert, these disenfranchised societies and layers of the society don't necessarily like each other. So if you want to represent working class, if you want to represent LGBT, you want to represent the Roma population, you want to represent refugees, you cannot do this because they also don't necessarily like each other. The working class is not pro-refugee, is not necessarily pro-LGBT, and so on. And left-wing parties tend to choose refugees, LGBT, or the Roma even, and not the working class. And this is why the working class started to go for other alternatives. The third is the revolt of the members of the nation. Many, especially in Central Europe, feel that being proud of your nation is a bad thing, and mainstream parties don't really appreciate this. This is also an important narrative. And the fourth one is about the revolt against globalization. This is my favorite part, but I won't talk much about this. We know that globalization creates economic problems, creates a field of danger in the cultural field, and so on. I think I will jump this idea, but as you may know, Steve Bannon was recently in Hungary giving a public lecture. Have you heard about that? I was there, and it was actually a very good speech from a rhetorical point of view. So he can do what he wants. He can achieve what he wants to achieve with a speech. If there will be a question about this, I will be happy to answer it, but I have to move on because my time is limited. So, this was my first question. My second question is, how do populists behave? One of the major problems with politics, as I mentioned, is that politics became very, very boring. Nobody cares about politics anymore. I don't know whether they cared about it previously, but nowadays when you can watch Netflix, you can watch series, you can go to the movies very cheap, and this is very cheap, you don't care about politics, right? And what populists do is that they make politics more interesting. Recently, my friends in the European Parliament say to me that actually European politicians themselves don't care about European politics that much, and they prefer to watch American politics with Trump, because that's more interesting. There was an investigation of election behavior of populist states, and they actually saw that populists are only 15% more negative, 11% more conduct 11% more character attacks, and they conduct 8% more fear messages than mainstream parties. If you ask me, this is not a systematic difference. These are very low numbers, I think. What they can do is that they make this more interesting. And that's something which we have to care about. What happens if a populist can get into government? In this, Hungary has a very good and long experience now. What happens is the culture of compromises is on the decline. So if you have a populist leader, he or she, but let's face it, it's a he probably. So he doesn't compromise. There is a lack of rational debates because all the debates is about emotions. All the debates is about the poor society wanting to defeat the elite, and there is no compromise with the elite. A third consequence is the lack of transparency and accountability. If you have a strong leader, you don't have to make him accountable. Fourth, the representative democracy is highly criticized, not just by the politicians, but by the voters as well. Fifth, national sovereignty is pictured as a zero-sum game. If somebody can interfere in my politics, then that's bad for me, so we should question this. And from the fifth point, the sixth point also coming, which means that if you are concentrating on national sovereignty, you will question transnational issues. So you see transnational threats as a way for the international elite to interfere into your national sovereignty, and that is why you have to question climate change, migration, and so on. And also, foreign policy will be subordinated to domestic policy. Maybe that's interesting only for me as I'm into international relations, but not necessarily important for the whole conversation. So how not to fight populists? That's my third question. Populism is about debates, about fights, right? So populists want fight. If you don't have a fight, populists would cease to exist because populists need fights. So when you are fighting them, when you are shouting with them, when you are criticizing them, when you are questioning them, when you are making jokes about them, you actually contribute to their success, because that is what they actually want. And we know this very much in the case of Hungary. This is the vicious cycle of populism, as I call it. This is a framework which I developed based on my experience in Hungary and regarding Hungarian foreign policy. So bear with me. The first step of the populist government is doing some populist things. So populist behavior is the first thing. The state starts to behave in a populist way. What happens is that there is an outcry, internationally and from the elite. And this is very, very good for the populists. When Viktor Orbán introduced the new constitution, the new media law, and we can start the list and 2 hours later. So during all these measures, he was very, very happy that everybody started to criticize him, because that's good for him. In this case, he can picture that, yes, I was right, they are attacking us, they are the international elite, because it is the international elite which criticizes him. So he can engage in this so-called populist theater, which is basically to frame this whole debate on the international sphere as the populist struggle against the international elite. And that creates growing support in the domestic field, because people will say that, yeah, he was right, we are attacked, and this leads to more populist behavior, and then that circle is going on, and the populists get more and more support. So why do people and politicians make this huge outcry, like Macron or other parties and other politicians? For non-populist politicians, this is also a good thing. So this is not a zero-sum game, this is a positive-sum game. This is good for the non-populist as well, because he or she can make an image out of criticizing the populist. But this won't defeat populism, this only strengthens populism. I didn't bring here, but have you heard recently about the Sargentini report in the European Parliament, which basically described how the Viktor Orbán government destroys democracy and liberalism, and this is how the EU started the process of Chapter 7, maybe. Something like this. All right, so this is how the European Parliament started to vote against Viktor Orbán and the whole Hungarian governmental behavior. And this report was accepted in a vote in, I don't know, in October maybe this year. If you see this report as a Hungarian liberal who doesn't necessarily support the steps of Viktor Orbán and his government, this report was laughable from many respects, even as people in the opposition side would support me in this. This report was full of half-truths, right? Half-truths which are right in many instances, but for example in the report you were able to read that anti-Semitism is on the rise in Hungary. We never felt this. Actually, the Jewish community in Budapest, half of the Jewish community of Budapest supports Viktor Orbán to a great extent. 40% or 50% of the Fidesz voters are actually Roma. So you can criticize Fidesz about racism, but you have to be aware that Roma people vote for Fidesz, because Fidesz gives them public jobs. And if you see the NGOs with whom Sargentini, the Dutch MEP who made the report, consulted before writing the report, this list is full of NGOs who are, I wouldn't say laughable, because they are doing a good job, but on the other hand, we won't, as an academic, I won't take reports as a basis of objective truth. I would always question them because they are politically motivated, because that is what they do. This is not something extraordinary, but they are not the representation of objective truth. And Sargentini didn't contact the government, didn't contact right-wing organizations, so that is why even from a liberal perspective, these reports are very, very unuseful. Please don't make such reports if you have any effect on this, because this won't change everything. This only helps Viktor Orbán. So, my last question is, sorry. How to fight populism? So this is not this is how not to fight populism. You shouldn't participate in this vicious cycle, because that only helps populists. How to fight populists in the right way? If you want to differentiate between causes, problems, and consequences, where should populism go? Many people see it as a problem or a cause, but it is not. It is only a consequence of. So it is only a consequence of a problem, and the problem being the perception of mainstream parties being highly ineffective and not able to better the situation of the vast majority of people in the society. And that's the problem. The causes for this are numerous. We can talk endlessly about this, but populism is not a problem, and populism is not a cause of our problems. It is only a consequence. Populism is the failure that we, not populists, achieved in the last decades when we failed to provide alternatives and solutions. And this is very important to see. On the other hand, populism is not necessarily a bad thing. As I mentioned, the populist culture, the populist tradition is centuries long. If you see the American populism, if you see the European populism or Australian populism, because there is such thing as Australian populism, there are good things in there and there are bad things in there. There is a recent article which differentiates between thin populism and thick populism. Thin populism is what we usually call populism. Both are actually very innovative in their setting. Thin populism is disrupting democracy. It wants to use these fears, these perceptions to rise to power and basically starting to dismantle institutions. Thin populists try to isolate the individual and gather his or her individual support for this populist cause. Thin populism doesn't believe in the community, it just uses the fears of the community to rise to power and dismantle institutions. On the other hand, thick populism, which is also very innovative, can be enhancing democracy. What does that mean? This means that the feeling that the elite is doing something wrong is there. If the elite would do everything right, then we wouldn't need anything, basically, in politics, because we could just let the elite do what they want. But it is a very democratic idea, actually, that I, the citizen, should participate because those guys cannot do everything I want. So I will engage as a citizen into politics, and that's populism as well. That rises from the idea of populism as well. So this thick populism can be democracy enhancing because I believe in a true community. I believe in the value of community, and I engage in a community of activists over a network. And then I will try to reform institutions and reform how things are done by the elite. And this is very important. We should be open to changing our institutions because our institutions are failing us in many questions. Some examples for thick populist campaigns. This can be useful as well. Voices for Indy was a campaign in 2013 by a local community in Indy, Australia. The population of this small town believed that they are not represented enough and their local representatives don't care about their lives, so they created this initiative in which they gave voice to the members of the community and they managed to force politicians to make other decisions, and they even ran campaigns and everything. Another successful example is the restorative justice movement. The restorative justice, as you might know, an idea in justice philosophy that when you are dealing with an act of crime or anything, you shouldn't concentrate on punishing the individual who committed this crime, but rather to restore his or her position in the community and concentrate on the community side, the collective side of the crime which was committed. You can see examples of that in Rwanda, for example, in tribal societies, when they don't want to punish the individual, but the emphasis is more on how to deal with the problems which was created inside the society and in the community. The third example is the White Ribbon campaign, which tries to raise awareness regarding the the male culture in violence against women. This started in the early 1990s, I think, in Canada. And also the Orange Sky Laundry program, which was basically a way in which local citizens try to organize voluntary and free and mobile possibilities for homeless people to wash their clothes and other sanitary, and improve their sanitary conditions. So these can be good ideas. Populism can be good, populism can be useful, and I think that what the mainstream parties forgot is that they should be thick populists and first, and not other ideologies, not other ideas, because this is how all things are done in a democratic society. You engage the community, you build up the community, and you fight together against something, and there is nothing wrong with this idea of fighting together against our common threats. So thank you very much. I hope that this was provocative enough, so bring me the questions, please. Thank you.